We're going to move on to the final panel discussion, which is building a smart city. And much of what we discussed this morning were issues related to the financing, the design, the technology. What we have in this final panel are actually people who are in the industry, currently involved in both managing and building projects and providing the technology to cities in terms of things that are actually happening. So we're moving now into the reality of what's going on in the universe today, as opposed to the theoretical things that will be happening in the future, although part of, I think, the reality that they'll be discussing are things that are quite in the future as well. So I'm going to just do a brief introduction of our panelists, and I'm just going to go alphabetically through the program. So I'm going to start with Melissa Birch. Melissa is a Senior Vice President at Forest City Ratner Companies. Melissa is also an adjunct professor at NYU SHAC, teaches urban economic development. She did quite a great job. And also worked with me at Forest City and has been actively involved in the shaping of Forest City's residential policy in New York City, particularly working on the 80 DeKalb building that just opened up on DeKalb Avenue in Brooklyn, and also planning the residential development for the Atlantic Yards project. Melissa is a graduate of Harvard as well as Harvard Business School. Jay Cross is the president of the related Hudson Yards project, in addition to overseeing what will be a major development on the west side of Manhattan, mixed-use development with lots of open space. Jay formerly was the president of the New York Jets. Prior to that, he was the chief operating officer and president of the Miami Heat in Miami, and was responsible for building the development of the American Airlines Arena. And also, Jay was the point person in Toronto for building the Air Canada Centre. So Jay has had a history of building large public-private developments, oftentimes involving sports teams as a venue or an anchor for the developments of the project. Next, John Gilbert. John is a long-standing friend. John and I go back to, I think, our days in the Koch administration many years ago, and currently serves as the Executive Vice President, Chief Operating and Chief Technology Officer for Rudin Management Company, rather. John has been very actively involved in overseeing and constantly keeping current the 15 million square feet that's under Rudin's management and ownership. He's the chairman of the New York Building Congress Energy Committee, and John also serves on a number of committees for Mayor Bloomberg, which is aimed at continuing to try and keep the environment green and basically gives a private perspective to what's going on with the city's 2030 plan. Yuri Pavlichik is a director of IBM's Research Industry Solutions and leader of the Research Smarter Cities program. Now, I know that the Smarter Cities program is entwined in many urban areas throughout the country, and they focus on helping cities to manage the complex set of demands placed on their infrastructure by cities' constituents, and on the optimization of the flows of energy, people, and water through this infrastructure. Previously, Yuri was a chief technology officer of the IBM Venture Capital Group and also a director of technology for IBM Research Emerging Business Group. So we have a wonderful group of panelists, and I think, Yuri, I'm going to turn it over to you first, and then we'll just go down the line. Thank you.
Jim, thank you very much. Let me see if we can find the presentation. Let's see. And let's see. We only use PowerPoint 2003. So let's see what the... let's see. The bottom, was it? They moved it. Thank you. I beg your pardon. So folks, you may ask, why is it IBM is at all involved in smarter cities, in cities at all? In fact, let me just ask my colleagues to raise their hands. They're very, very shy, this lot. The reason is data. You saw this afternoon where Professor Quigley talked about how you can look at the future of business in real estate and understand where the value is by improving the efficiency of a given system. What we hope to do, and I'll show you many projects around the world, is to take the data, use it to build models. Actually, first of all, find the patterns. Second, use it to build models and use those models to predict. When you can predict, there's an awful lot you can do. Now, when we first started looking at cities, we said, how do you characterize a city? So we decided to look at just the infrastructure part, and we said, look, there's at least three kinds of issues. One is you've got roads, pipes, wires, buildings, stuff that's in the city. And what do you have to do with it? You have to find out where it's broken, when it's going to break, to repair it, replace it, and rebuild it. The second thing we saw was the stuff that flows through that infrastructure. Electricity, water, people, steam, you name it. And what you have to do there is you have to balance the demand versus the supply. When you do that, you get to a much greater level of efficiency. And frankly, what we found in our studies of things like data centers is if you just fix things that are not working, you can save between 10 and 20% of the resource. You know, we spend $500 million a year on power for data centers. 20% is a lot of money. So we found in looking at smarter cities that the other issue is people. If there's no people, there's no cities, there's no demand. Yet we never take account of what people want or what they do. So part of what we need to do is to use social techniques for understanding what people want, how we can influence their behavior, and make things much more efficient. And we believe there's a number of areas that we can do that. Now, unless you have safety and security, you can't build and deliver services. And unless you deliver services, you can't build a lifestyle that people want to come to your city in. These are just very simple things, yet if you take this idea of asset management here, it's a pattern. Why is it an important pattern? Because we can start throwing our software at that, use the same software over and over again to say, which pipe is broken? Which wire is down? Where's the energy not flowing? What's the phase angle? All those things you can start looking at and use the same software pretty much to analyze the problem. So let me try and take you a little further. These are just some of the engagements we've got worldwide looking at smarter cities. And the idea of smarter is just, if you don't remember anything from this conference, please remember this. There's data. From that data, you can create models. You can predict where traffic flows. You can predict where the energy is going to be used. And once you can predict, you can decide what you're going to do with it. When you can decide what you want to do with it, you drive your business. And so from that, you get more data. It feeds back to the beginning. Let's see if this opens. In the meantime, as this link opens, what I'd like to show you is some other experiments that we've done. How much more time? 2 minutes?
You got as much time.
As much. I've never heard this before. You've got as much time as you want. Okay. So let's see. Undaunted by. Okay. Let's see. All right. We're going to excuse ourselves with this one and try and hold this. Okay, so we're not responding. That's even better. Okay. Thank you. It's not much of an inconvenience. Oh, we'll resume the slideshow. So let me just continue while this is going up, please.
Can I ask, how is directing energy sources and energy sinks super incredibly different than the classic transportation problem, optimization problem?
It's not, except today, the amount of data that we use to find what's required and what's available, it's completely separated. So for example, the New York ISO, what they do is they figure out based on data that happened a year ago in similar climatic conditions, how much energy is required for the following day. And then they go and buy that energy until the bucket is full, and then they just ship it. Now, if people could tell you how much they really wanted without making any effort of it, you can make a big difference to that. That's the point. Okay, so let's finish this off with a couple more examples. We did an experiment in Dubuque. What we did was we hooked up 300 water meters, 250 actually, and measured the water usage every 15 minutes. Each of these people, families, contributed to that. They volunteered their information. What we also did was we split them up into 5 groups of 50. And in those 5 groups of 50, we gave them the ability to see what each other group was doing in terms of usage. Each family could see how much water they were using per day at any time. They began to understand their patterns of usage. The competition drove down the overall use of water by a factor of some 10 to 15% for the people that were really involved. And for the people that weren't really involved, it drove down by about 8%. It just goes to show if you can affect people's behavior, you can reduce resource usage without doing much more. Finally, if you look at how you can really extend this, if you had a mobile device, and that mobile device allows you as a human being to go and report traffic jams, utility outage, and have the analytics to be able to precisely pinpoint where the problem is, the sources of the problem, you can really build a very sophisticated 311-like system. And this then gives us the whole idea about a smarter city. The smarter city provides you with the data that lets you make decisions based upon fact, not on opinion. It allows you then to integrate the city as an end-to-end entity and then finally provide much better quality of life. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuri. Melissa, please. Melissa.
Hi, Melissa Birch with Forest City Ratner Companies. I don't have a slide presentation, which is a bit unusual, but I wanted to take a minute to give you a little bit of an overview about Forest City. Forest City Ratner is part of Forest City Enterprises, which is a publicly traded company on the New York Stock Exchange. The company is an owner, developer, and manager of over $12 billion in assets throughout the U.S. I think it's important to understand that we are a developer, a manager, and an owner, because I think a lot of what has driven some of our sustainability initiatives and strategies to date has really been the fact that we live with our properties long term, and therefore we have a stake in the performance of these properties and in the performance of these buildings. We have a very large commercial presence. We have almost 17 million square feet of retail properties and 15 million square feet of office properties. In addition, we manage over 50,000 units, apartment units across the country. We have, I wouldn't call it a third group within Forest City, but we do have a burgeoning group within Forest City called Sustainable Resources. That's really been driving a lot of the kind of thinking within the company around energy. One of the, and I'll talk about scale in a minute, but one of the things that I think is exciting about Forest City being so large is that it really has an opportunity to experiment in a number of different locations with a number of different strategies around energy. Currently, we have projects around the country that deal with solar, waste to energy, things like anaerobic digesters, wind, and cogeneration. Here in New York City, we have, through the Forest City Ratner portfolio, been involved in commercial development for the last 20 years. This has been important to kind of understand that we've really come at this from an office perspective, and most of our office space is actually in Brooklyn. What happens when you are the owner of office space in Brooklyn is that we need to figure out ways to operate more efficiently and at a lower cost, because the rents that you get in Brooklyn are not Midtown Manhattan rents. What it's really meant is that as a company, we've had to be very inventive and smart about energy and efficiency from day one, because it's been critical to our success and the ability for our projects to make sense from an economic standpoint. This type of approach we have broadened as we've looked at our marquee project under development at Atlantic Yards in downtown Brooklyn. Atlantic Yards is a large mixed-use public-private development project at the intersection of Flatbush and Atlantic Avenues in downtown Brooklyn. The project consists of over 22 acres of land that is being redeveloped into an arena for the New Jersey Nets, soon to be the Brooklyn Nets, office space, and over 6,400 residential apartments. These 17 buildings will be built out over over a 10-year period. And in order to support these 17 buildings, an incredible amount of planning and infrastructure needed to be put in place in order to support this new development, but in order to create this new community and campus in a sustainable effort. Scale matters, coming back to scale, because with a project of this size, you have an incredible opportunity to do not just interesting building systems, which, you know, we could spend an entire day talking about just interesting building strategies, but we have interesting site strategies around our sustainable initiatives that I wanted to speak with you about today. So a project of this size has the opportunity to actually improve existing conditions that exist today. So through Atlantic Yards, we are creating a more sustainable environment through our infrastructure and planning process. This is seen in a number of ways. Public transit improvements. We have a new subway entrance that we're in the process of constructing that will lead directly into the main entrance of our arena. This public transit improvement and subway connection actually connects people to over 10 subway lines and the Long Island Railroad. So we are not only taking advantage of a system that exists today, but also improving it through accessibility. We're also creating a new rail yard for the MTA for their Long Island Railroad branch. We're creating a brand new facility that we will ultimately platform over. But before we platform over that yard, we are making significant upgrades to the efficiency of that yard through a whole brand new yard that has new switching and toilet cleaning capabilities and other things that they actually do in that facility that have been in place since, you know, for over 100 years. We are upgrading and modernizing that facility, making it more efficient and expanding its capacity. We are doing significant work in terms of brownfield redevelopment. The site that exists today is a combination of industrial uses through the rail yard, but also there are old gas stations, there are abandoned warehouses. We are remediating the entire 22-acre site and, again, improving a condition that exists today. Lastly, I wanted to speak about something that doesn't get a lot of airtime, but I thought I'd use this opportunity to talk about our stormwater management system. Stormwater in New York, I've come to learn, is a really interesting and challenging topic because the sewage system is consisting of both dry weather flows, which are sanitary sewage, and wet weather flows, which is rainwater. These two systems are combined, which means that when you have a large storm, you have sewers that overflow their capacity during these storm events. Atlantic Yards is located in the Gowanus Canal area catchment. And the Gowanus Canal in particular is very sensitive to the issue of water quality, which is exacerbated by this CSO event. CSO stands for Combined Sewer Overflow. Atlantic Yards has made the commitment through its planning process and then will execute throughout the development process that we will not have any incremental CSO events. We do this by retaining over 900,000 gallons of water on the site, which means that during a storm event, through water retention tanks, through innovative open space techniques where we're able to retain water on the site through ponds and other type of water features, we're able to hold the water on the site and wait until after the storm event and after the peak, and then start to release it very, very slowly into the sewage system so that that CSO, that overflow event does not occur. In addition, once we have started retaining the water on site, it makes sense that we look at ways to try to redeploy that water. We are doing that through makeup water for cooling towers on the arena. We're doing that by having landscaping strategies where we're able to water plants and the like through the retained water so that we're not taking fresh water from the water system. And in the future, we will look at strategies like gray water, potentially black water. Nothing is in the works specifically for the residential program at this minute, but we are in a position now that we are retaining that water to kind of think strategically about how we can redeploy that water and start to do more with reuse. Presently, we are in the process of building the arena, which is the first building of this 17-building complex. The arena will open for the 2012 basketball season to host the Nets. So we are well underway and under construction. The arena is a LEED Silver structure, and we're very proud that it's on track to attain that type of designation from LEED. But I think also if you kind of go out there and take a minute to really assess what it is that we're doing on a day-to-day basis, you'll see that not only in the planning process, but also in the construction process, we're doing everything we can to try to incorporate sustainable type of construction features, whether it's recycling waste, whether it's trying to use electric instead of diesel fuel, and when we have to use diesel fuel construction equipment, making sure that it's low sulfur. So these are all strategies that, while some of them are big, some of them are small, but it all is a part of a kind of broad face that Forest City wants to put forth as being a leader in these type of sustainable strategies and these type of sustainable developments. Thank you very much.
Jay told me I had to help him get his PowerPoint up. But someone's got to help me, maybe.
Let me help.
Let's get this one down.
Three old guys, hypothetical.
Is this yours?
Yeah.
There you go. So, I just got to figure, which button did you hit? You ready to get it up?
Hit slideshow.
This one here, slideshow. I think you just got to do this now.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to talk a little bit about Hudson Yards, our 12 million square foot project on the west side of Manhattan. We're committed to build every building to a LEED Silver standard, and our anticipation is that we'll build every building to a gold or platinum, including neighborhood development. But we tend to think of what a smart project's going to be in something other than LEEDs, and they've sort of fallen into three basic baskets. The infrastructure master plan. It's not very often you get an opportunity to build 26 acres. We also then think about how we make these buildings smart in and of themselves. And then the third thing, which is sometimes I think lost in the debate on the technology side, is just the quality of the environment we aim to create. And there's a lot of issues here which are not technology driven but are unique. So the master plan itself is, as I said, it's 26 acres, two 13-acre plots on either side of 11th Avenue between 30th and 33rd Street. It's roughly 50-50 between residential and commercial, and that diversity comes back to help us substantially in energy consumption models. All of the gray buildings here are commercial, roughly 6 million square feet of commercial, including 750,000 square feet of retail. On the far right is 3 commercial buildings on top of the retail podium, and to put that in context, it's twice the size of Time Warner Center, just that far right piece. Once we build the 26-acre platform, the idea was, well, we don't very often have that much opportunity to do it, and rather than rely upon what's in the streets, and you only have to go around Manhattan and see how much fun it is to rely on what's in the streets, we decided that we should build, by virtue of building our own streets, we'll build our own infrastructure trench. So the infrastructure is actually a figure 8. Doesn't look like a figure 8 here, but that's designed to give 2 means of entry into every single building, 2 means for every utility to come into every building, and we'll have the ability, ITs on one side of the trench, power generations on the other side of the trench, hot and cold water and waste management in the middle of the trench. Trench, roughly speaking, is about 4 feet deep by 20 feet wide, and it will weave its way through the platform and under the 11th Avenue viaduct. We spent a long time deciding how we're going to bring cogen into the project. I mean, it sort of starts with a premise that you have to have cogen, but what was really driving us was not so much just the premise to have cogen, but in order to be able to assure our commercial tenants that they had complete redundancy. Not redundancy in the context of when a Con Ed substation goes down, because that doesn't really happen very often. It's more, we had to be able to say you have redundancy when the eastern seaboard goes down. And that meant that we had to figure out a way to provide 20 megawatts on site. At the same time, you don't want to build your cogen plant so big that you can't use all the excess heat in a form of a trigen. And so getting the model to work perfectly has taken us pretty much 6 months to get here. And we think we're at that point now where we'll be providing 10 megawatts of trigen on site with another 10 megawatts of emergency power. And total demand will be in the neighborhood of 40 megawatts, but 20 will keep us going, keep the office buildings going in the case of a blackout on the seaboard. And that's going to be very important, I think, in being able to tell tenants they're off the grid. We have over 500 piles that go down to bedrock, anywhere from 30 feet to 150 feet. We're looking at the possibility of geothermal piles. They won't provide a lot of energy, but it's a nice thing to do if we can make the numbers work. I think the jury's still out as to whether or not we can make geothermal piles work. Like Melissa mentioned, we too retain all the stormwater on site. When the yards are built in the 80s, if you look at them, they're all concrete deck. And so right now, you have 26 acres of rainwater that washes off that deck in every storm. There's a minor retention pond. The great news is that there's a dedicated stormwater culvert right out into the river so that they never mix with the sewage system. In our case, we'll enhance the retention tanks throughout the site, but we'll also be harvesting the water to the greatest extent possible for landscaping because we have 50% open space, potable water, and cooling tower makeup, amongst other things. On the IT side, we've formed strategic partnerships with Verizon and United Technologies, and I think we'll be bringing others in to work with us. It's very difficult to know what we should be providing for. I mean, we're building a 40, 50-year commercial complex, and so whatever we put in today will be outdated within a few years. And one of the things that we're starting to think about is the wireless office, which we're convinced is coming, and we have to be prepared for it. How are we going to get there? And in that context, some of our experience in sports stadiums is interesting because there you've got real bandwidth problems. When everybody's in a sports facility and they're all using your cell phone, you cannot move video around. And so we're having to go to different bandwidths within the spectrum, and we think that we're going to have to provide a broader spectrum on Hudson Yards so that we can enhance the wireless capability. And in addition, of course, we'll have fiber going everywhere. And then linking all of the buildings together in a smart grid, smart control system is going to be incredibly important. And there, UTC's been very interesting to work with. They also do an awful lot of life safety fire suppressant systems, and integrating all of that, building security with employee security and residential security is going to become an interesting challenge. And so the smart buildings, of course, double means of entry, but then single duplicate risers, but everything going up vertically has to have two ends to it. And then the last point I was going to make, which is the environmental quality. And we've done a lot of research on what makes people feel like they're in a great neighborhood. And it's interesting when you actually do the research with workers and residents and, say, shoppers and visitors, everybody has a different definition of what a great neighborhood is in New York. But what's been interesting to us is that when it comes to workers, they don't necessarily think Park Avenue is a great neighborhood. That they want a neighborhood that's lively, like Madison Square or Gramercy Park. And so we think in terms of, we're worried about this every day, how do we ensure that what we build for the commercial worker is going to work just as well for the residential tenant or resident? And so we've done a lot of thinking about that, and one of the great attributes of the zoning, and I give the city planning department credit here, is that we're required to have 50% open space. So making sure that those open spaces are wonderful spaces that are programmed 24/7 is a big part of the challenge we have. But we think that we're focused on it now in a way which we believe will create a great space. And we're surrounded by even better open space. The Highline Park, the Hudson River Park, and the new Hudson Boulevard Park, which will terminate with the new number 7 subway stop. It's a unique opportunity, I think, in Manhattan to have this much open space integrated to a building. Bike storage is an interesting one because it's now becoming part of the planning doctrine, and everybody thinks of it as, oh, well, I got to buy a bike room. In our case, we have to buy room for 5,000 bikes. So it's going to be like Shanghai, I think, in terms of how we figure this out. The other thing we're doing on the buildings is that we assume, and this has been common practice in London now for decades, that every building will have raised floor throughout. It's not really that common here in New York, except in user-specific buildings. We think that all tenants will demand it, and so we're designing the buildings from the get-go with raised floor. Sunshades, high-performance glass systems. We're doing a lot of research on the walls. They might be different from north to south to east, but we think that we want to provide floor-to-ceiling glass. We've got to do it in a smart way. And among those ways which we're investigating are operable windows. Our mechanical engineers howl and shriek when we mention this, but we're serious about trying to bring operable windows into a commercial environment. This is the Samsung World Headquarters in Korea. If they can do it, we can do it. And so that's our overview of Hudson Yards. Thanks very much.
I'm going to ask John to come up. John's going to talk about not only new buildings, but he's going to talk about what he's doing in his existing stock as well. John.
Thank you, Jim. Actually, it's Dean Stuckey, right? I knew Jim when his real name was Jim. Now it's Dean Stuckey, and I'm having a hard time getting used to that. It reminds me of when Michael Rudin's great uncle Jack was asked. We was called the dean of the dean of the real estate industry, and he said, "Dizzy or Daffy?" And for those of you who are too young to remember, there were two pitchers who pitched for St. Louis. One was Dizzy Dean, one was Daffy Dean. But I do want to acknowledge Michael Rudin. Usually I don't care what I say at a speech. I kind of let it flow. But since Michael is here, I've got to be a little bit more careful. Some very interesting comments that were made, and I'm going to try to thread them all together and really focus in on what we see as what's happening out in the world in terms of really creating an environment, a livable environment, because that's the one word I haven't heard yet today, and that's what people want. They want a livable environment. They want to be comfortable in their homes. They want to be comfortable in their offices. And there are a couple things that are happening. And I think first and foremost, if you don't remember anything else I said, remember this. Vacant buildings do not consume a lot of energy. What does that mean? You know, I get very upset when I hear, and I love Mayor Bloomberg, but he always stands up and he says, 70% of all electricity are consumed by buildings in the city of New York. Not true. If those buildings were vacant, there would be no consumption. It's the people who live and work inside those buildings that consume that energy, those electrons. And that's what we're missing. I think Yuri said there's two pieces. There's data and there's people. Well, we built 3 Times Square. We built it to a LEED Gold standard before there was LEED Gold. We filled that building up with a wonderful international company called, now it's Thomson Reuters, it was then Reuters. We then go back and try to get LEED EB, and I can't get an Energy Star rating above 50%. It's an efficient building, but it's what the people are doing inside of it that's important. So what we're focused on, and another metaphor, we're focused on introducing Nikola Tesla to Robert Metcalf. I want the electrons of Nikola Tesla and alternating current, and Edison should be mentioned there too because he was the direct current guy, a lot of direct current stuff's coming back, to Robert Metcalf who created Ethernet. I want those photons of light to influence consumption patterns of electrons. What we have to do is really think about that premise. Why? Because is it important to have efficient buildings? Yes. Is that the end of the story? Absolutely not. We have to influence consumption patterns. We have to give people the tools that they can ultimately control, measure, and manage their energy consumption. If we don't do that, game over, forget about it. Fascinating article in last month's New Yorker about how it's not about efficiency. They use the analogy of more efficient cars. We make more efficient cars. Did the amount of gasoline consumed go down? Absolutely not, it went up. Why? Because ultimately it's cheaper to drive. You're gonna do it a little more. I use the low-fat yogurt, ice cream analogy, right? Hey, it's low fat, I'll have two bowls instead of one. So at Rudin, what we're trying to do is make that introduction. We're trying to create interoperability between the information technology grid, those photons of light, and our really dumb, stupid electrical grid. Off, on, off, on. How do you do that? What does that infrastructure look like? Is it wired or wireless? Both. Jay talked about that, and I agree with everything Jay said, except I think Park Avenue is a really good neighborhood to have office buildings on.
Better than Wall Street.
Well, we got them there too.
That's why I asked.
So this interoperability, what does that mean? What is that? How do you retrofit an older building to make sure this all happens? And why does it matter? On the residential side, it's pretty simple. If you look at what Google's doing, if you look at what the TED 5000 is, anybody know what the TED 5000 is? The energy detective? Ooh, very bad. TED 5000 is a little device, it's a dashboard. Shows your BTU consumption, shows your electrical consumption, shows you how much money you're spending in real time. You put a little clip at your meter, it can only work in a single-family house. We're going to make it work in a multifamily situation. And suddenly, you now see what your energy pattern is. Base load, peak load, you start unplugging stuff. The needle doesn't move. The fridge doesn't move. The TV, ooh, that moves. So you're sitting in bed, ready to go to sleep, there's nothing on in the house, and you look at that TED 5000, and you're still burning electrons. The house is asleep, but it's not. Cable box is cooking, TV's cooking, fridge is cooking, but you gotta leave that on. It's mostly your entertainment stuff. Phones, Blackberries, iPhones being charged, burning electrons. Suddenly, you have the tools that you can now see, I can influence this. I can change my consumption patterns. So what are we doing? Wi-Fi Zigbee, crucial to this whole question. Ubiquitous Wi-Fi, Zigbee-enabled networks throughout buildings, I think, are the answer. Unless there's going to be a new flavor of wireless, that's number one. Number two, some very interesting companies that are now creating smart switch plates so that you have your power strips that have a little Wi-Fi Zigbee-enabled radio in there that is now talking to your meter. So I take out my BlackBerry, I'm on my way to the airport, I left the air conditioning on, I'm a knucklehead, boom, I can turn it off. It's done. I fly back into town, I land, it's 90 degrees out, middle of August, I'm on my way in from the airport, that AC unit's on. I've just influenced my consumption patterns by shaking hands with an IT network to an ET network. Commercial example. It's all about driving this same concept down to our major commercial tenants. Why does a BlackRock or a Blackstone or a KPMG or a JP Morgan Chase, why do they care about their base load? Because it's real dollars. It's real dollars. Yuri mentioned the data centers that IBM runs 20% on 500 million. You do the math. Real dollars. So what do they need? They need the exact same tools. They need a wireless network because the meter in the basement needs to connect to the cloud and ultimately create that dashboard on whomever's desk is monitoring this. Can be done, but you've got to have that wireless piece. They then can begin to understand, you know what, it is base load, peak load, but it's also the delta between the two. You got to drive your base load down, and the peak load is another thing we got to look at, because peak load, that's when everybody's chugging, that's when everybody's working. But you got to make sure that those people are actually working and doing what they're supposed to be doing, ultimately to validate the electrons that they've burned. So, another great book that you should all read, Devil in the White City, the story of the 1892 World's Fair in Chicago. It was the first glimpse that the entire world had of the modern urban city. Centralized water distribution, centralized natural gas distribution, electrical distribution. That's when Tesla beat Edison, alternating current beat out direct current. Walt Disney, his father, went there, saw the first Ferris wheel. We all know where that germ of creativity ended up. That was the first glimpse that the world had of what the modern urban city was about. It was about open space. It was about parks. It was about all of these centralized distribution systems. Today, we're exactly at the same place of this merger of Tesla and Metcalfe. It's very, very exciting. And it's Michael Rudin's generation who are pushing the rest of us to get our arms around this and to figure it out. Because there's 500 million feet in the city of New York today. We've got to go after that mass of space, make it smarter, make it greener, and make it more livable. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. I'm going to ask one question, and then I'd like to open it up to the audience to ask questions. But I know from my years as a developer that usually real estate makes up about 5% of a company's operating costs, and human capital makes up about 50% of their operating costs. So I think that what a number of you have said is that you've got to work on the human capital side in order to make the buildings really smart, because putting all the technology in, if it's not used appropriately, isn't going to achieve the kind of goals that you'd like to achieve. But one of the things that also troubled me, and I'm just curious if each of you could talk about this, is that in order to do some of the bold things that's being proposed, we talked about this very briefly this morning in terms of things like waste to energy. It requires huge regulatory changes. And oftentimes the processes that were meant to protect the environment take longer now, or result in things taking longer, so that things that could help the environment take years to get improved, and sometimes to get approved when the technology is old. So Jay, why don't you start off and just give me your thoughts on that?
We're not planning to do anything that requires any kind of regulatory approval. We negotiated our 99-year ground lease with the MTA, and I think I've done with the regulatory environment for a while, that they were actually very good to deal with. But we only look at technologies that we think have a reasonable track record, and we realize that nevertheless we're going to put extra money in, but we consider it a land cost, basically. But we don't want to be on the bleeding edge. We want to be in the leading edge only.
That's a good way to say it. Melissa?
Yeah, I mean, I would also agree that we're not going to be on the bleeding edge, but, you know, I would also kind of speak to the fact that, again, having that scale will allow us to, you know, experiment with technologies in the first couple of buildings, and they will get perfected over time. And so, you know, having that pipeline, having the ability to test different things out around the country, I think is going to help us take things away from the bleeding edge, because I agree that's a scary place to be, mostly because we're not technology experts. And, we're building experts. There's certainly technology in those buildings, but I think that we're going to be looking for proven technologies and to really push the envelope in terms of planning strategies and site strategies, and build in the flexibility that we need to be adaptable over time.
Yuri, how much of the work that you do around the world is shaped not by what's feasible, but what can be done based on stakeholders?
Interesting. Good question. Most of the time, IBM's job is to help our customers. So rather than go focus on driving a legislative agenda of our own, we try to help our customers do that. So for example, we might, because we're good at managing data, right? We know how to bring it together, how to analyze it, and how to extract the meaning. For example, you saw the Watson thing, but that's a whole separate thing, right? But extracting that meaning is what our customers want. And when we can do that and help, for example, build a rate case for a utility, that's what they want us to do. On the other aspect of stakeholders, you know, we deal with, quote, smarter cities. What do you have in a city? It's not just data, it's people. It's the government employees who either are there full-time or they've been re-elected. What do they want to do? They want to get re-elected. So you have to look at many aspects of a city to try to drive the agenda forward. It's nowhere near as clean or as simple as it used to be to just install a mainframe. Now you're dealing with people, politics, you name it, the whole stack.
Mm-hmm. And John, I sensed some frustration when you talked about the mayor's buildings giving off energy, so this question was teed up for you, actually.
Well, we did an interesting experiment where we put in, one of the things that drives me crazy is that, you know, the lights that you leave on in your stairwells, 24/7, 365, drives me nuts. So we put in battery-operated systems that are motion sensors. And it was great. You know, saved a lot of money. Then along came the fire department. The fire department said, no, we got to take those out, because we want you to have glow-in-the-dark strips on all the stairwells. And we're like, well, time out. Well, what are those for? Well, if there's a blackout and you got to go down the stairs, it'll glow in the dark and people will be able to see, you know, their way down. I said, I got 6 hours of battery life on these lamps. I don't need any glow-in-the-dark stuff. Well, if unless you take them out, the strips won't charge and they won't glow. And they made us take them out. So there's a perfect example of government on the one hand saying, yeah, this is a really good thing to do, and on the other hand saying, no, this is a really bad thing to do. And the bad always, unfortunately, in this situation won. But I think the case has to be made ultimately, what's the goal? And if we focus on livability, if we focus on common sense, and in terms of the technology, we're not smart enough to figure out how all this technology will work, but we are smart enough to figure out that if we make the investment, and if we look at this as infrastructure that allows smart people within our buildings to make smart decisions, that's good business.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have about 5 minutes left before this panel ends, so let me open it up to the audience for questions, please. Yes?
If I could just make a further comment, Charlotte Matthews is related, that New York City just underwent a 2-year, well, it took about a year and a half of the Green Codes Task Force, went through all of the existing building codes and looked at obstructions to green innovative, such as waterless urinals. And now that created a relationship between the Mayor's Office, DOB, and REBNY, the Real Estate Board of New York, that now when, for instance, DEP is looking at a stormwater detention up to 90%, that REBNY was brought to the table to talk about how to design that so that it doesn't thwart retention, which is the reuse of water and things like that. So I think New York City is fairly unique in recognizing the limitations of code.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, please. She has a microphone for you.
First of all, I'd like to say it's amazing to know that Watson is focused on green buildings and technologies for buildings.
Not yet.
It's amazing. That's definitely a huge step for our fraternity. The next question I have is scalability, knowing the scale at which IBM works and the kind of systems you were talking about of smarter cities. It could work for Forest City Ratner, it could work for Hudson Yards, but will you be looking at scalability in terms of, incorporating the smaller developments?
Especially into existing buildings, yes.
Exactly.
So yeah, I think definitely my colleagues that sit around the table go to quite a lot of meetings with developers to see how we can use these approaches to just help minimize costs and improve the whole operation. Absolutely. I mean, Dubuque was one good answer, 300 meters, right? Now we're doing 3,000. Now we're helping them figure out how to run the city in a more efficient manner. So yes.
Other questions, please? Yes, please, sorry.
I think one of the great challenges that New York faces in becoming a more sustainable smart city is that most of the infrastructure is 100 years old, like what you're facing at Atlantic Yards and at Hudson Yards as well. What do you guys see as the most optimal way to retrofit old infrastructure to adapt to new technologies?
I mean, I would say that first and foremost, there's an incredibly close collaboration between Forest City and the City of New York. Developments of this size and scope certainly need to be public and private in nature, precisely because of these interconnections in with the infrastructure. There's an incredible amount of infrastructure on site, and I think that Jay mentioned this as well, that is actually disconnected from the rest of the from the rest of the grid. And I think that that is one way in which private investment is being used to further public infrastructure. So I think the collaboration has got to be very, very close. We have to make sure that there's an equal partnership, and I think that Bloomberg and his team have been very, very good about trying to find ways to take advantage of what developers have to offer by way of doing that, whether it's improving the sewer system, which we're doing at the Atlantic Yards site, whether it's the remediation, whether it's expanding the subway system through the entrance and connection points to access the existing subway lines. All of that is an intense collaboration. I think there needs to be more of that.
I think one of the things we need to do a better job is utilizing the private sector to a greater degree on infrastructure requirements. That the way we've built infrastructure here stood us the test of time very well 40, 50 years ago. But I think the fact that we can't build our airports fast enough, and we can't build new subways fast enough, and we can't do viaducts fast enough. There's miles and miles and miles of conduit under the street that's not being used. And I just think that by asking government to always do it and always go out and borrow the money to do it is perhaps asking too much. And the number 7 subway is an interesting example. The city's paying for it. And so it's not exactly privatization, but it's outside the norm. It's not the MTA building it as they would normally build it. And guess what? It's ahead of schedule and it's on budget. It's a good story because there was an outside governor on the engine that says, my money, I want to make sure it's well spent. And I think that that's what we need to do in terms of, we're woefully behind infrastructure. I mean, you don't have to travel very far to feel it. And it's going to catch up with us if it's not already.
So therein lies lots of jobs for all of you who are in Shack, privatizing the infrastructure. I want to thank our panelists very much. You all did a great job. Thank you so much.